Good evening. I'm James Roth, Deputy Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of my colleague, Stephen Rothstein, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all my library and foundation colleagues, I want to thank you for coming this evening. I also want to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters at the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. I'm also delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening, and when Q&A starts, we invite those of you who are joining us in person tonight to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. During the height of the Cold War, it's not surprising that the Kennedy administration concentrated on the containment of communism. During 1961, in their view of the world situation, Berlin was the focus of world attention. However, that problem only could be evaluated against the background of a worldwide communist challenge. This extended to the policy in Asia. Following discussions with the Vice President of the Republic of China in August 1961, a joint statement was issued referencing three critical challenges of the time. Both President Kennedy and the Vice President of the Republic of China expressed concern over the future of Laos. According to the joint statement, President Kennedy further stated the U.S. position by expressing his hope that the Geneva Convention on Laos would result in a neutral and independent Laos, but the United States would not approve any arrangement that resulted in a communist regime. President Kennedy also stated, quote, that the United States is determined that the Republic of Vietnam shall not be lost to the communists for lack of any support which the United States government can render, end quote. Both the President and the Vice President welcomed the policies announced by the new Korean government to, quote, continue its partnership with the free world, to oppose communism, and to combat the economic problems that face the Korean people, end quote. While many of the challenges President Kennedy dealt with have changed, there still remain issues today. We are pleased that in tonight's timely conversation, our guests will discuss contemporary U.S. foreign policy issues in Asia. I'm now delighted to introduce tonight's panelists. Catherine Moon is Professor of Political Science and the Wasserman Chair of Asian Studies at Wellesley College, where she has taught since 1993. She is a non-resident senior fellow and the inaugural holder of the SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies at the Brookings Institution. Her many writings include Protesting America, Democracy and the U.S.-Korea Alliance, and her current book project, New Koreans, Defectors, Immigrants, and the Future of Democracy. She is a member of the Harvard Kennedy School Korea Working Group and is an affiliated faculty member at the Korea Institute, Harvard University. Sheila Smith is a senior fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is the author of numerous books and articles, including Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics and a Rising China, and Japan's New Politics and the U.S.-Japan Alliance. Her current research focuses on how geostrategic change in Asia is shaping Japan's strategic choices. She joined the Council in 2007 from the East-West Center, where she directed a multinational research team in a cross-national study of the domestic politics of the U.S. military presence in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. I'm also pleased to welcome back as our moderator for this conversation, Ambassador Nicholas Burns. Ambassador Burns is the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Try putting that on a card. Professor Burns served in the United States government for 27 years. As a career Foreign Service officer, he served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 2005 to 2008. He also served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ambassador to Greece, and State Department spokesman, and worked for 5 years on the National Security Council at the White House. So please join me in welcoming our special guests for this evening.
Jamie, thank you very much. It's a pleasure, I think, for the three of us, I know for the three of us to be here. We're excited about being back at the Kennedy Library. I want to thank Steve Rothstein, who's been such a great director of the John F. Kennedy Foundation, the Library Foundation here. Thank Jamie, thank all the staff here. It's such a beautiful place. When we drove in tonight, you look out at the harbor, beautiful day. Spring has finally come to Boston and New England. The Celtics are winning, the Red Sox are winning. All's good with the world. So we're going to have a good conversation tonight with two of the country's great experts on Asia, Dr. Kathy Moon and Dr. Sheila Smith. We thought what we'd do is we'd have a conversation where I'd ask them some leading questions. We wanted to cover why is Asia, the Indo-Pacific, so important to our future. We want to talk about that. We want to talk about China and the very difficult, complex balancing act we have with China now. We certainly want to talk about the big summit meeting coming up on June 12th in Singapore, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, the odd fellows of international politics. Wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall in that meeting in Singapore? And we want to talk about our allies. We are so deeply embedded with the Republic of Korea, with Japan, with Australia, with India, our newfound strategic ally. We'll talk about those subjects. When we finish our conversation, we'll open it up to you. We've got microphones. We encourage you to ask questions of our two experts. So let me just lead off, maybe Kathy with you, and talk about why we Americans should be focused on the Indo-Pacific. I would ask the question this way. A friend of mine, Robert Kaplan, whom you both know, lives out in one of our beautiful Massachusetts towns, Stockbridge, Massachusetts. He writes great books. He's a strategist. In his 2011 book, Monsoon, where he talked about the importance of the Indo-Pacific, he said the following. He said, power is shifting from the Atlantic and Mediterranean world, where there's been more economic and political power and military power over the last 500 years in Europe and the Mediterranean than any place else. It's shifting to the Indo-Pacific. He said by mid-century, 2050, the four strongest military powers in the world will all be in the Indo-Pacific. Japan, in no particular order, India, China, and the United States of America. We're very much a Pacific power. Four big economies, and that more of what matters to us and to our kids and grandchildren will happen there than any place else in the world. That's a powerful image. It's a powerful point. Maybe Europeans would debate it, but Dr. Moon, do you essentially agree with that? And how do you look at our power position as Americans in that part of the world?
I agree and disagree with that observation. The agreement is yes, the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, it's a vast, vast collection of states, islands, and a lot of important security issues, as we know now, dealing with North Korea. And of course, the global economy depends so much on both production and consumption within Asia. But it is not a unified region, unlike Europe, and I still say Europe is unified, even though the EU is struggling. But relative to any other part of the world as a continent, the EU is way ahead in terms of economic, political, cultural coordination and sharing. Asia is still very far behind in terms of people-to-people understanding, the cultural gaps, and of course the historical gaps, which Sheila and I have done extensive research on, both in terms of Japan, Korea, China. So I think Asia still has a lot of catching up to do, despite the huge economic and military firepower it potentially can have by mid-century. I would just focus here on China for a minute, because many people look at China as the US's main rising rival. And I take a somewhat different perspective, that even though we look at China from the outside as this huge mammoth, both in terms of population, economic firepower, and potentially a military rival in the Asia-Pacific, if not globally, China internally is a very difficult to rule kind of place. It is huge, and the Chinese leaders right now are struggling every day to keep that large land mass together with a collection of hundreds of minority groups, languages, etc. So when we say China, I think we need to be careful. It's not this unified landmass and culture. And in order for nation states to be really strong, even if you have military capability and economic capability, you need to have national cohesion. And China, without the Communist Party, would lack that. India also lacks internal cohesion because of this great diversity it has, which is a plus and a minus in some ways. And I think by mid-century, the US will still look at Europe for many reasons as its main regional ally. And that as long as security issues do not get worse in the Asia region, Asia will be important economically, but not as important as some people might think.
It's interesting. Sheila, it's true that right now, Europe's the largest trade partner of the United States, the EU.
Right.
It's the largest economy in the world. Europe's the largest investor in the American economy. We have more American allies in NATO, far more, than in the Asia Pacific. So why do people like me keep saying that the future, our grandkids, our children's and grandchildren's future is really going to be in this Indo-Pacific region from, if you had a mental map here, from the east coast of Africa, the energy producing part of the Middle East, the Arabian Sea, the subcontinent, the Bay of Bengal, the Strait of Malacca, all the way up to the North Asian economies, that this is going to be the heart. Do you agree, disagree?
I agree. Let me just sort of say, though, that this is not new. The United States' history with Asia is actually very rich. So this is not something that's happening now because Asia is becoming more powerful. Our engagement with the Asia Pacific, or Indo-Pacific as we're now looking at it, goes back centuries. It was our black ships that knocked on the door of Japan, right? It was when Japan was rising as a new power, we were also identifying ourselves as a new global power.
19th century.
19th century, yeah. And so, and then the 20th century, of course, we had these disastrous wars, the huge conflict that was largely fought out in the Pacific towards the end. So America is deeply embedded and engaged with Asia in all different kinds of ways. But what I think is new is exactly what Kathy was saying and what you were saying earlier, and Dr. Kaplan says as well, is what's going on in Asia is beginning to drive global economic activity, drive, I think, some geostrategic fault lines that we're going to have to pay more and more attention to. And I think we cannot not be engaged. Now, the Asia Pacific versus the Indo-Pacific, I think, is an interesting...
Yeah, tell us about the two names.
Yeah, it's an interesting place to pause for just a second to make sure we know what we're talking about. So the Asia Pacific is that vast East Asia all the way across to California, right? I mean, the Pacific Ocean binds the Asian continent to us, right?
And Chile.
And Chile. Then you get into things like the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, and you think about other parts of the Trans-Pacific, exchanges. And yes, you have the whole other swath of South America to add in the mix. But when people today talk about Indo-Pacific, they're doing exactly what you did, is they're looking at not just Asia, but what's on the other side of it. So not just East Asia, but Southeast Asia, South Asia, and all the way across, as you know, to the Middle East from the opposite direction. Those are the sea lanes of communication. That's how we get our resources. They are also fundamentally important to our military. If you go to Hawaii and talk to the Pacific Command, their area of operations goes all the way over to Pakistan, right? They don't see it as a very minute place. They see it as a very expansive place. And of course, today we're looking at these partnerships, as you said, with Japan, with Australia, with India, and of course with South Korea. We have a very deeply knit set of diplomatic partnerships where we have very similar interests in both prosperity and in security as well.
Thank you.
The Indo-Pacific is an interesting concept today, I think.
May I add one more item for us to think about when we think about the power in Asia? This is something that is not usually addressed when people talk about national power and regional power, but Asia, especially China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, these are countries that are experiencing some of the lowest birth rates in the world. So when we're looking and projecting ahead, not just to the mid-century, but past that, we need to keep in mind what will happen to these societies as the Asian population gets older, with fewer younger people to replace workers who have retired, and fewer younger people to actually support the elderly population. Japan, South Korea, I know especially South Korea, Japan has a bit of its head in the sand right now because it is really resistant to immigration. But South Korea considers the demographic crisis a national security, national interest crisis. And China, more and more, is looking at its population decline, when only a few decades ago it worried about the increase, as more and more of a national security concern. So I think we need to factor in that Asia is not just booming in some ways, and it will continue to do so, but also factor in these internal changes that could potentially have some kind of a negative effect on this trajectory toward growth and power.
Thank you very much. And important that you're giving us a sense that there's not just a monolith out there, that these are countries struggling as well, because we tend to see the positive side and the power side of the South Korean economy, or China's Belt Road Initiative, for instance. Let me ask about China before we get to North Korea. Ambassador Steve Bosworth was 11 years dean at Tufts Fletcher School, American ambassador to the Republic of Korea, to the Philippines, President Obama's North Korea negotiator, and unfortunately Steve passed away 2.5 years ago. Prior to that, he came into my class called Great Powers. We were looking at the great power relationships of the world. Here's what he said about the U.S.-China relationship. He said it's going to be the single most important relationship that the United States has in the 21st century. And he said the American people might find that balancing the complexities in our relationship will be the most difficult thing we've ever done in the history of America. And I stopped him. I said, Ambassador, in front of my 75 students, the revolution, the South's rebellion against our union, the First and Second World Wars, you think that the challenge of China is going to be more difficult? He said, yes. And whether you agree or disagree, here's how he framed it. And here's how I want to frame it for you, Sheila, and you, Kathy. He said, China's going to be our most important partner. Climate change, managing the global economy, coalitions to defeat human trafficking. China's the country with capacity. He said, but at the same time, China's our great strategic rival for military power in the South and East China Sea, out to the second island chain. America's been the behemoth since the end of the Second World War, but China's going to challenge us. And he said, how do you balance a situation where our most important partners, our most important competitor? That's the question I'd ask you, Sheila.
So I have a great deal of respect for Ambassador Bosworth. So I think he's right.
You do, okay.
But I do think, so there's two pieces. One is the US-China piece, which is essentially what he was referring to. And the other is China's relationship with its neighbors, or this broader Asia Pacific. And so there is this cleavage between economic power and military power. And a lot of the countries of Asia have deeply interdependent economies with the Chinese. The networks, the global networks of production run in and through and around China, as do we, right? So we have $500+ billion in trade every year with China. We are deeply, whatever happens, whether the trade war that President Trump is talking about proceeds or we negotiate, our future will depend on a good economic relationship with China. But so does Japan, so does South Korea, so does the rest of the region. So it's not just us that face this conundrum of being strategic.
India does too.
India does too, right?
Yeah.
The strategic competition can only be fought is the wrong word, but I'm looking for a different verb. Waged, thank you. It's a much nicer word. The strategic competition can really only be waged by us today. Japan can't compete militarily with China. I doubt even a unified Korea would attempt it. There's no other power out there that can confront. If the Chinese decide to go down a much more challenging route, the United States is dependent upon by many, many countries in Asia to be the counterbalancer to that military power. So it may be the most defining issue in our relationship, but I think it's also how US and China manage this unique kind of relationship. Strategic rivalry will affect the rest of the Asia Pacific as well.
Thank you. Kathy.
I would echo a lot of Sheila's thoughts here and just emphasize we need to have friendly competition, friendly rivalry, sportsmanlike rivalry. Because, and one very clear, quick answer to how do we manage this is keep them close to us. Keep them close through trade, I think the current trend right now in the Trump administration is a wrong-minded one in terms of picking a fight on trade with China. I think that there are so many issues that the United States and China can agree to work together on. We achieved this through the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement, in 2015 under President Obama. And there is no reason why China, that had been so resistant to US leadership on climate change because it interpreted it as a way for the US to keep China down economically, if China can come on board and decide that it wants to help lead, there's no reason why we can't look for these kinds of opportunities in the future. I think right now the question to me is, when we discuss these issues about policy in East Asia or anywhere else, is the Trump moment right now a blip? Is the 4-year period of Trump a blip? If there is to be an 8-year period, will that be a blip? Or will we go back to normal, that is, after this blip? Or will the blip continue to have a trajectory that in some ways becomes irreparable? And I really hope the answer is not irreparable. I think on environment, China and the US proved to each other that no serious agreement can be reached without each other.
On climate change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And on security issues in the region, right now with North Korea, but it might be other issues. There's very little that either China or the United States can do on its own in East Asia and possibly globally. And I think it's better to accept that. In some ways, it takes all of the burden off of the United States, right? Let China help. Financially, if something were to happen in East Asia that calls for funding, let's say North Korea, if it decides to join the international community, where is the funding to rehabilitate North Korea's economy, education, technology going to come from? It's going to be Japan, South Korea, hopefully China. Right? If the US were to be smart, it would try to keep China very, very close.
So I've been a persistent critic of President Trump, and so I always look for opportunities to say something positive when he does something positive. Isn't he right about China's trade practices? Hasn't China ripped off the intellectual property of countless American and other companies? They've used their state intelligence agencies to go after our companies by nefarious means, and shouldn't we have a tough-minded approach? I mean, is he to blame for the trade war?
So, can I just say yes and stop it?
You can say something nice about him.
I'm trying. I'm thinking really, really hard. No, there's rhetoric and there's tweeting, and then there's the substantive question of, is this approach by the Trump administration, which is a hardball approach, right? And I'm not saying that that's not warranted, but is this going to get us what we need? And where I start to worry is the tweets that came yesterday or this morning, I can't remember, about
ZTE.
making it, the ZTE, right?
Backpedaling.
So, the backpedaling, and she and I are going to make a deal, and we're going to make sure that this telephone company, right, this company is going to get what it needs. I don't want our foreign policy or our larger economic policy decided on the fate of one company, for example. There are a lot of issues where actually intellectual property rights, the industrial policy of 2025, there's ways in which we should articulate American interests. We should talk about market access. We should talk about predictability of the treatment of our businesses and others, Japan, et cetera, the Korean businesses, et cetera. We should push the Chinese on areas where our interests are at stake. Absolutely. That's the friendly competition I think that Kathy probably has in mind as well. We should not hesitate to articulate and advocate for our economic interests. Absolutely not. Is threatening a trade war is the kind of haphazard sort of, it's 50 billion one day, it's 100 billion the next day. I mean, I'm not sure those tactics are actually going to serve our interests over the long run. I think what we want is a serious, engaged conversation. And you have experience on the cyber dimension as well. We have a lot of areas where the Chinese and the United States do not have a common understanding of how our interests have suffered over the last decade. And we have to continue the hard diplomacy to get the attention of the leaders in Beijing. I'm not sure this approach is going to do a service to American economic interests.
Kathy?
Just a few quick thoughts. I agree with Sheila for the most part. I think when we look at China, I myself, if I were part of this so-called trade war. I try to separate the intellectual property from the actual trade aspect. The intellectual property rights are a serious problem, but that does not get American people's blood boiling the way trade and the loss of jobs, as Mr. Trump has been emphasizing over and over, really excites people in sometimes negative ways. And I look at the hardline approach by Trump as really disingenuous. And it's intellectually shallow and it's politically disingenuous. Intellectually shallow, why? Because Americans benefit from cheap goods that China imports, exports, and that we import from China. Americans are not only producers whose jobs might be threatened by Chinese companies and Chinese cheap goods, but also Americans are consumers. And so
we're paying lower prices for a lot of we're paying lower prices for a lot of things that we need.
Absolutely, and for the bulk of the American middle and lower middle classes, made in China is a standard part of our lives. We need China in that regard. So President Trump is talking to his base, but it's his base that gets hurt, and the rest of us along with it. The second part is, and so that's both the academic as well as the political. That academically, it just doesn't make sense to keep harping on trade in this kind of a ludicrous 25% slapping, et cetera. It's too arbitrary. It also is really offensive, I think, to a lot of the, not only China, but to US allies, right, in Europe and Asia and Canada. And if you're going to focus on trade, then figure out how to make American workers more productive. We have a basic problem with productivity. It's not just because Chinese are taking away jobs or dumping cheap goods on the United States as input products for American industries. Can I just add, there's a country missing in this talk about the Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, which is Russia. When you talk about China and its potential threats to the US economy, cyber activities and all this, I can't help but think of Russia as, right now, our largest threat. China, no matter what it does not try to bring the US democracy down.
Right.
Russia has, and after Trump, will continue to do so as well. So I think we need to keep the size and weight of potential threats, rivals, in a comparative light, and I wouldn't put China up there along with Russia at this point.
That's interesting. So short term, no question, we have to contain Russian power, both the hacking of our election, but also what they're doing in Eastern Europe, south and west of their borders, preying upon smaller neighbors. But long term, I want to ask you both, before we get to North Korea, about the Belt Road Initiative. If the big idea of the first decade after the Second World War, President Kennedy's time, he came out of the war as a veteran of the South Pacific. He ran for Congress in 1946 here in Boston, was elected, so the beginning of his career. The big American idea was the Marshall Plan. Yeah. We're going to help revive our defeated rivals, Germany and Japan. We're going to rebuild Europe and Asia. I think in 2018 dollars, but I'm looking at Professor Frankel, will correct me, the Marshall Plan in 2018 dollars was about $190 billion. The Belt Road Initiative is now the big idea of our time. It's China's huge infrastructure outreach to 68 priority countries, not just in Asia, but all the way across the Indo-Pacific into Europe, into the port of Piraeus in Greece, where the Chinese state company now owns it and controls it. The Belt Road Initiative is going to be more than $1 trillion. And we have, I think, we're offering no such alternative, the United States. Are you impressed by the Belt Road Initiative? Is it a double-edged sword for the people who take the money? And should we be responding to it in some way with a big initiative of our own, Sheila?
So I think it's too early to know whether OBOR is the Belt and Road Initiative, exactly how it's going to manifest itself. It's largely a commercial enterprise, and it's largely focused on knitting together the Silk Road expansive to the expansion to the west, right? And it's a lot of infrastructure building, some of which I think the region could benefit from clearly. And AIIB is there to fund it, to help. But
Asian
the
Infrastructure and Investment Bank.
Investment Bank. So I have no problem. Those are the kinds of things that are exciting for the region. The question is what rules and standards China is going to apply, and whether or not the recipients of the commercial expansion of China are going to have a voice, and how much of a voice. So there's a lot of countries in the region. Australia, Japan is about to announce another Japan-China discussion on OBOR. There's a lot of countries that want their companies to be able to participate in OBOR, but they also want to raise the commercial standards by which the Chinese proceed. So I don't think it's not the Marshall Plan exactly. Politically it has that kind of impact perhaps, but it is a very commercially organized initiative by the Chinese to help expand and create business opportunities abroad. And I think, again, as we look and read about the experiences of smaller countries who get a lot of Chinese largesse, who have rented their ports, for example, think of Sri Lanka, to the Chinese at terms that then leave them indebted to China for decades, or they can't ever pay it back, and therefore they are subject to Chinese influence in ways that are uncomfortable for them. I think we have to watch very, very closely to make sure that we can help. I would like to see the United States engaged in the conversation on OBOR, just like the Japanese and the Koreans and others, to raise that standard of transaction, to make sure that there's transparency and accountability, and to up the game a little bit. And I'm sorry and sad that we're not engaging in that conversation a little bit more with the idea of shaping OBOR, participating in shaping, in the same way I was disappointed when we didn't have a conversation on AI.
On the bank.
Yeah, on the bank.
So we're using interchangeable terms here. It's sometimes referred to as One Belt Road, One Road,
Right.
OBOR, or the Belt Road Initiative. They're interchangeable initiatives. Kathy, the Indian government has been very skeptical about this. They see this as a big power move against them and Japan, and the Indians want the Japanese and Indians to offer kind of an alternative. So this is it's not been accepted by everybody, this big Chinese project.
I think partly because people aren't sure where it's going to go. If we saw real successes right away, more people might simply say, oh, this is a good deal, we'll sign on. So I think skepticism is a normal part of a project that is still in the making. But also, as we're talking about today, a lot of it is about power projection and what China intends to do through OBOR. And I agree with you, Sheila, that the U.S. is so used to acting only when we can take the lead internationally. And I think we cannot play that kind of a role any longer. There are things we can lead on. Hopefully after this administration, we can lead again on the environment and climate change. We can lead on human rights and democratization, because democracy is slipping so quickly right before our eyes, not only in our country, but in Eastern Europe, Asia, even parts of Western Europe, one could argue. So there are ways that the U.S. uniquely can take a lead, and where we have a history of credibility, where only we can do that. But on many other issues, I think the post-World War II, we can look at the Bretton Woods system as an example. After World War II, the U.S. led the entire economic rehabilitation for Europe, Asia, U.S., everyone, through the Bretton Woods, the liberal economic system that the U.S. led. That eventually fell apart because even the countries we tried to help through the Marshall Plan, for example, in Europe, in Japan, they grew up. They gained economic power, political power. They wanted more piece of the decision making, and they were not going to go along with the U.S.'s hegemonic leadership in a regime that they benefited from 100%. And I think we have to now look at this situation as China and other countries are saying the same thing. We too are growing up. We too have more capability. We also have more desire to be part of the decision making. And the Chinese did offer access for many countries to join, including the United States, for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the US, partly for political reasons, leadership reasons, said, oh, God, no. We can't succumb to a Chinese-led international institution. Why not? Why not? Look what happened with TPP. We led it, and then we broke it, right? So we're learning that even among ourselves, our word is not golden. We don't even keep our word sometimes, and this administration is proving that time and time again. So I think more and more we need to reach out, join other nations' initiatives, and do what we can as a global partner, not just as a US hegemon. I think that era has ended. And it's not Mr. Trump who brought it to an end, but I think the reckoning really needs to take shape.
Can I just a point on the
Please.
AIIB
Please.
decision, because I think it's not well understood here in the United States that we, our Congress, if we were to join in the AIIB, we would have to put up funds.
Money, right.
We'd have to put up money, and the Congress would have to approve it. So when the Obama administration was reticent, it was largely, one, we were never going to put up money that was in an organization led by China. But I think where the fatal flaw was on that, at that moment of decision making, is we encouraged our allies not to join as well. And I remember conversations with the Australians coming to town and the Japanese kind of coming to me going, I don't know, what do you think? And the Japanese were not going to step out from the US-Japan relationship and do it. The Australians in the end decided to go ahead.
As did the British and the Germans.
The British and the Germans, and they independently thought this was not a bad idea.
Yeah.
And when you create a new multilateral regional bank, you also have to be accountable and responsible to global financial practice.
Yeah.
You don't do it in a vacuum. And so in some ways, the multilateralization of China's investment in the region is in fact a plus, because it raises the standards by which they have to lend money. It also makes them more accountable to global markets and to governance, right? So negotiating governance structure inside the AIIB was a really important part of the process. And Germany and the UK and Australia understood that. The Japanese were too nervous, but they discussed it later. And I expect the Japanese will eventually join. So we're on this cusp of what is a good financial policy, or what is a good economic policy decision, and what is a geostrategic power
Right.
game, right? And that's the cusp at where what you brought up at the very beginning, our economic interdependence with China, and yet our strategic rivalry. We're at the cusp here where we're making these decisions, and we're not sure on what basis to make the decisions, I think. We're getting a bit confused.
Well, I think that's right. And I think one of the problems that a lot of us have in watching President Trump is there doesn't seem to be a strategy in place. He's tweeting, he's reacting, he's impulsive, he's impatient, he's firing off criticisms of the South Koreans and Australians, and then he makes up with it. President Obama had a strategy. You can agree with it or disagree with it. He said, we're going to pivot to Asia, rebalance. We're going to put 60% of our air and naval assets, not 50, in Asia versus Europe, because that's where the greater challenge is. He said, we'll have our joint venture with China on climate change, and it worked. And the biggest idea was that we'd be the leader of a 40% of global GDP trade alliance that would challenge the two big protectionist countries, China and India, keep them out until they played by the rules. Brilliant.
Yes.
President Trump undid that in his first week as president and got nothing for it. He walked out of the TPP. He got nothing for it. He walked out of the climate change agreement, had no alternative. He walked out of the Iran agreement last week, nothing. Competitive alternative idea. What do we do next?
Yeah.
This is an administration that likes to walk out, but doesn't have a sense of how do we protect American interests. Does that worry you? Did the TPP decision worry both of you?
Yes, she's the TPP expert, so I will leave most of that to Sheila. But I think more than walking out and walking away, the fact that the countries who do cooperate and did cooperate with the United States go on. TPP 11. TPP countries without the United States, they decided we're going to renegotiate some aspects of this, and you know what? Life goes on without the United States. Iran and Europe are trying to figure out, how do we make life go on without the United States? That is very bad.
Yeah.
That is, I think, the biggest lesson right now is not how to walk in or walk out, but how to stay the course and make sure that the U.S. stays, if not indispensable, at least so highly valuable as a unique power that can contribute something positive and constructive. And that's the kind of faith that has been lost.
So the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a complicated, I don't know how to say it all in a minute or two, but I thought the Trans-Pacific Partnership was in American interest, right? Yeah. So I am on that side of the debate. I think what was difficult about it is it was 12 countries. And a multilateral trade negotiation with 12 countries meant that a lot of the details of the final pieces of the negotiation could not be made public until the deal was done. And then it was presented to our legislators, right, to ratify, and whatever the ratification process was in each of those 12 countries. Many of those 12 countries were democracies, therefore it had to go to legislators. Our Congress had to see it, they had to debate it, they had to decide whether to go ahead or not, right? Same in Australia, same in Japan, right? So it's a complicated process. As diplomats know, it's not easy to get that kind of process done. I thought that President Obama could have talked about it more at home. I thought there was a case to be made for the economic interests of the United States that were served by TPP. But by the last piece of that timing, and again, it ran right up against our presidential election, the case was made for the strategic value of TPP. If we don't write the rules, China will.
Yeah.
Absolutely true. But there was also economic benefits to the United States in the TPP. And I think that that argument got short shrift here at home. And so you had a real reaction to it. Whether you were in the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, there was a reaction. And I think the secrecy and the difficulty of that negotiation was part of the reason, right? Nonetheless, the United States would have, with its partners, Japan, Australia, not only our allies, but our other economic allies.
Mexico,
Mexico, Vietnam, the future economic partnerships for the United States were incredible. Yeah. And for the region, the rhetoric was right. This was a new high standard trade agreement that incorporated labor, right? Regulation, environmental protections, the problems that we found with NAFTA. It was a corrective to what the complaints were about NAFTA. And so in some ways, it was the best of both worlds. It was American leadership and it was economic benefits for us, but it was also pulling the region, this dynamic Asia Pacific, in a direction where it would be much more liberalized economies and much greater scope. As you said, 40% of the global GDP would be in the TPP, and that was an incentive deliberately, I think, created in the hope Korea, China would make the transitions necessary to come along. And I think the South Korean government had already signaled, even before President Trump came along, that they wanted to come in the next iteration, right? They wanted to join. So it was a huge setback for us, I think, economically as well as strategically. And it left the Japanese holding the ball. And I think at first Mr. Abe said, okay, we're done. And then he brushed himself off politically at home and he said, nope, this is a good deal. It's what we want to do. And he and the Australians led it to completion as TPP 11.
And hope the Americans come to their senses.
And he continues in his golf cart to tell President Trump.
Golf diplomacy.
Come back. And I don't know, in the summit he calls it now the free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. It has a new name now.
In a way, this links back, I'm looking at Steve Rothstein, to President Kennedy. He lived through the disastrous protectionist wars of the early 1930s when he was a young man, student. As president, he really reached out to Asia Pacific. He appointed one of our greatest ambassadors, Professor Edwin Reischauer, to be ambassador in Japan. But he led the Kennedy round of the early 1960s to reduce global tariff barriers. I mean, he had this sense that we need to be free traders. We need to be confident that we can survive, we Americans, and compete. We don't have to be fearful of everybody else. And what's happening now is so un-Kennedy-like in terms of the wisdom he brought to it. Let's talk about Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. We've got to talk about that before you go to questions. So we've been a little bit critical here of President Trump. I think he's done well on North Korea, Kathy and Sheila. I mean, after the war of words against Kim Jong-un, between them in 2017, Rocket Man and nuclear buttons and all that, President Trump turned away from this idea that we would launch a conventional attack on North Korea, the bloody nose strategy, and instead he's embraced diplomacy. He's going to have a meeting, a summit meeting. There's never been a summit meeting between an American and North Korean leaders, June 12th in Singapore. He has got the Chinese doing more to leverage and intimidate North Korea than I think we expected he would. He and Moon Jae-in have worked well. Shinzo Abe and he have worked well. Doesn't he deserve a little bit of credit here that he's set up a interesting dynamic where we might be able to resolve this by diplomacy, not force? Kathy.
Okay, so I would say yes, Mr. Trump deserves two things that he can take credit for, and I will reserve them for the end of my little part here. I would agree with you in terms of a bigger package that he could lay claim to and even say, I really deserve, I've earned the nomination to the Nobel Peace Prize.
Before we even have the
that
summit.
he's fantasizing about. I mean, I could support that if the way you described it had been intentional. If that had been a strategy, if you had been behind him, feeding him that strategy, I would have said, this is brilliant. But in truth, that's not how things have worked out. President Trump had no strategy regarding Asia and North Korea in particular. He had pretty much knee-jerk responses to just fist, 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 pound them, pound them, pound them, pound them hard sanctions, and potentially threatening them with a preventive war, surgical strikes, etc. Did that scare the North Koreans? Not really. It scared the South Koreans to death, our allies. So I look at what Mr. Trump did in 2017 was bring us very close to the brink of war, bring us to a near breaking point in the alliance with South Korea, and test the Chinese to the point where the Chinese might have really had to choose between North Korea and the United States. Fortunately, it did not go that far. The reason why North Korea has come, I won't say 180 degrees, I'd say 45 degrees, 60 degrees, whatever angle they're trying to get at. The reason why they are in a transition mode is because North Korea, the regime, does not do anything off the cuff. They are planners. Americans in this administration, we are not planners. North Koreans have been planning for a summit with a sitting US president for about 60 years, since the grandfather's days, Kim Il-sung, who set up the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. North Korea, under Kim Jong-un, they were very clear. The North Koreans are not so unpredictable. They're really predictable in many ways. They tell you what they're up to, actually. And then they show you all these videotapes of live fire missile tests and nuclear tests so that we can all see what stage they're at. But they have been verbally saying to us for years, Kim Jong-un, that the nuclear ambition is part of what they call the Pyeongjin strategy, parallel advance, meaning economic development and nuclear development, and along with regular military development. As of last April, when North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un met for a plenary session of the Korea Workers' Party Central Committee, the large governing body, or the elite governing body, they basically gave up the Pyeongjin policy, and they said, no more of this dual track, now it's single track economic development. They don't say the word reform. If you meet a North Korean, don't ask them, how's your economic reform going? Just say, how is your economic development going? But that is the path that he and the party leaders officially have chosen, and that's the path that was part and parcel of the dual-pronged parallel advance strategy. What Kim Jong-un did starting in late fall was send off in November the ICBM launch to show the US we got capability to reach you, although we know it's not operable. They cannot reach our
But they
mainland.
could reach the United States.
They
Boston,
can't.
Dallas, right?
They cannot. They do not have the actual capacity to do that.
But that's the intent.
Perhaps that was the intention,
Yeah.
but Trump took that so seriously, and I'm glad he did in some ways. But the North Koreans basically have used the Winter Olympics and President Moon's ascendance into the presidency to take up Moon's offer from last summer when Moon was in Germany. President Moon of South Korea in Germany already gave the list. We will invite them to our Winter Olympics. They can join the world. They can become part of the international community. We will induce them to come toward peace. Kim Jong-un took that opportunity come January 2018, and step by step, we've ended up here. So I do not give Mr. Trump credit except for two things. Number one,
You're a tough grader.
for saying, I am a
Professor,
tough grader. I have
professor.
several of my students here, actually, from Wellesley. President Trump and the administration was absolutely on target to make an exemption for a couple of the key delegation members from North Korea to go to the South because they were sanctioned by unilateral sanctions of the United States as well as the United Nations Security Council sanctions. Without the lifting those sanctions, for that time being, these people could not have gone as part of the North Korean delegation. Number two, the US government agreed to suspend the joint military exercises, which basically expand to about 300,000 people on the Korean Peninsula every spring for 2 months. And the US agreed to suspend that military exercise, which does really upset the North Koreans, in order for the Olympics and for now the peace dialogue to keep going. So I think those two decisions by the Trump administration do deserve credit.
Thank you. I've got to ask you both, and Sheila, I want to turn to you, and then hear again from Kathy. You have to admire the ingenuity of this young man. 34 years old, no prior employment or management experience. The only American he'd ever talked to was our pretty good ex-basketball player, Dennis Rodman, until he talked to Mike Pompeo, secret trip by the CIA director, Easter weekend, and they kept it a secret in this day and age.
Yeah,
No
I know.
Facebook,
Yeah.
no Twitter. I mean, really well done by President Trump, give him some credit for that. But Kim had never had a meeting with another head of government. He'd never been out of North Korea as president to meet another head of government. He's really young, but hasn't he been driving this bus? Everyone's reacting to him. And this is a well-planned strategy. You just took us through his strategy. It's impressive, Sheila.
So I think it's interesting to watch. So I have to do the first question, then the second question. So the
Yeah.
Kim Jong-un part for me is kind of fascinating. It's fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is exactly as I think as Kathy laid out. The Kim regime, whether it's Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung, you can go back, the three Kims. We are at the kind of culmination of a dream that was laid out, decades ago, 2 generations ago at least, right? And the grandson gets to say, haha, I am going to meet with the President of the United States, right? And
His father and grandfather did not.
did not. And the closest we came to that, right, was at the end of the Clinton administration when Secretary of State Madeleine Albright went to Pyongyang to see if there was room there.
Yeah.
But by that time, we kind of knew that the North Koreans had reneged on the agreed framework, right? So we kind of understood that the political overtures were not going to get us where we wanted to be on the military side. But some people say we ran out of time, but I think the reality is we have never actually gotten this close to a direct dialogue at the highest level. Do I think it's a good thing? Yes, I do. I would much rather be where we are today than where we were 4 or 5 months ago, which was the revelation that the Trump administration was actually seriously considering what then became known as the bloody nose strategy, what was actually war on the peninsula. I'll tell you, last year I was in and out of Seoul and Tokyo both, with American policymakers and congressional delegation, and it was frightening in the region, quite honestly. I was there in April with a group, and it was the mother of all bombs were dropping in Afghanistan, and there was a second carrier task force was lost somewhere in the Pacific, but there was all kinds of rhetoric and signaling, none of which were coherent or reflecting a strategy, but all of it made the governments of our allies very uncertain about what American thinking really was. But if you were sitting in Washington in 2016, before President Trump arrived, you knew that the most pressing problem facing the next president, be it President Clinton or President Trump, was going to be the reality that we were confronting an acquisition of technology by the North Koreans that would threaten the United States. It was coming, and it was coming in the presidency in this term, whoever was the president. So there is a real conundrum here that the United States would have had to confront no matter what. I think, give him credit, absolutely. Was it completely planned? No. There was an awful lot of strong and heavy adult supervision, as we say in Washington, exercised by Secretary of Defense Mattis, by others in the administration.
By Mike Pompeo.
And by Mike Pompeo, as CIA director as well. So you've got a cast of characters underneath the Twitterverse that actually understood very seriously the danger that we were about to face. And the unpredictability of the White House was maybe partly deliberate, but I don't think it was completely deliberate. And that's where it makes me uneasy. But no Nobel Peace Prize from me. I do think that there's multiple levels of this game going on here that's fascinating. And one is, as you say, is Kim Jong-un himself. We saw him at Panmunjom with the South Korean president. Remarkable.
Yeah.
The body language, remarkable. The engagement.
Self-confidence.
The confidence, but also the nervousness and the heavy breathing. He had a hard time walking up those stairs. But this is a man, he's a little big, yeah? But this is a man in his own country who can get people to do anything they want, right? And there he was on the global stage with Moon Jae-in, with cameras, with all kinds of pomp and circumstance that are not the way he normally has to share the spotlight. And it was really remarkable to watch, frankly. But there's also Xi Jinping. There's also Shinzo Abe. And Vladimir Putin is lurking in there somewhere, right? We haven't seen a lot of symmetry by Vladimir, but the Russians have a huge stake in what happens. So there's a lot of different pieces of this puzzle. It's not just the Trump-Kim, although that's exciting and historic, but this is going to be a longer process because whatever happens on the Korean Peninsula will decide the future, military and strategic and economic balance of Northeast Asia. So we need to watch all of the pieces as they move. And I don't think all of them are being driven by the person sitting in the White House at the moment.
This is really interesting to hear from both of you. You're telling a story, but we're at the beginning of the story.
Yeah,
Maybe the
we're
beginning.
not at the end.
We're at the end of the beginning. So we got to go to questions, but you have to answer one more question. We got to get this out on the table. Summit meeting June 12th.
Right.
I'm absolutely confident Kim Jong-un will not give Donald Trump everything he wants. He won't give up he won't bring his nukes with him and say they're yours. So here's the problem. It took us 10 years from President Bush in 2005 to President Obama in 2015 to get around to the negotiating table and get a deal. It took us 10 years, 2 administrations. It's likely to take 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years to get to North Korea, if we ever get there, to dismantle their entire nuclear apparatus, their enrichment facilities, their missile sites, to give back or diffuse, dismantle, and give back to the International Atomic Energy Agency their nuclear weapons. If we ever get there, does our guy have the strategic patience to say, I'm willing to go through this. I'm willing to go through, for the rest of my term in office, innumerable meetings and frustrations and back and forth, or is our guy going to walk out if he doesn't get what he wants and go back to the bloody nose strategy? Kathy, what's your view?
Just dangle the Nobel Peace Prize right in front of his eyes, just every day. I agree with you, it's a concern, but I think what Trump will do, and Kim Jong-un as well, these two know how to play to an audience, and we've seen this now with Kim for the first time, through the international, as an international public, when he was at Panmunjom in Korea. But I think the Trump administration will compelled to get something, both that would appease.
That's positive, you mean? That's
positive, both to appease U.S. hardliners that North Korea gives something up, but at the same time, for quote the international society that the U.S. looks like it's trying to do something positive, it's trying to be cooperative and to lure North Korea into a better situation. I don't look at Mr. Trump's meeting on June 12th with Mr. Kim as, that's not the real start of negotiations. To me, that is the window dressing that tells people, come, look at this store, this department store, and let's see what's inside. What's inside has to be taken care of by serious people who are scientists, who are arms control experts, and who also are in the deep know-how about both North Korean politics, the internal machinery of politics in North Korea, as well as the region. So far, at least based on information I've read, the IAEA only has 300 experts who do the evaluation work for the entire world. And I've read that just for North Korea alone, to locate the so-called known 10,000 nuclear facilities of some sort, we're going to need at least 300. So we can't strip the IAEA of all of its experts. On the other hand, we are shorthanded. That's how difficult this situation will be. So if anybody thinks this is going to take a short period of time, even with most arduous, sincere negotiations, they are seriously mistaken.
Right.
South Koreans have put out the notion of 18 to 24 months. Now, I think that's crazy.
Short.
Too short.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there is a difference between Iran and North Korea. And I, too, am someone who believes in long-term negotiations to do the nitty-gritty and the confidence building and all that and the trust building to make sure that the accord you get is something that people will stick by. But Koreans in general, North and South, there's a word when you go to Korea as a foreigner you learn very fast. It's called 빨리빨리, fast, quick. When Koreans decide to do something, they do it. And they make sure it gets done. Now, it's very possible that North Korea wants to embark fully on economic development so that they want to take care of this nuclear obstacle as fast as possible. But intention and the actual practicality of doing the technical work that is laborious and time-consuming are two different things. And so I think just the technical aspects of this, not only the negotiations, will require years of time. Will Mr. Trump not have the patience? He won't have the patience. He most likely will kick it down the road to the next person. On the other hand, if he wants to run again, then he's going to have to own it.
And Mike Pompeo is going to be the point person. He's going to own
Right.
these negotiations, Secretary of State. Sheila.
And he was on TV on Sunday. All of us watched him. So just very quickly, so we can get to the conversation. North Korea and Iran they're not the same. Iran has not yet developed the capacity, or at least has not yet developed the arsenal, right, of nuclear weapons. North Korea is way down that path, and the barn door is open. So we've had this will be our third attempt to negotiate denuclearization, right? We had the agreed framework, which was largely carrots. We then had the comprehensive agreement in the September 2005 agreement, which is a larger sort of comprehensive piece in which denuclearization was a piece. This is the third time. They have never complied with the agreements that they have negotiated with us. Now, this could be different, and I don't think we should all be negative skeptics, right? And we can ignore the personality in the White House for a second. It would be so much better if this time was successful. But as Kathy said, what it takes to be successful will require that our State Department has significant resources and people in place to negotiate carefully, along with the IAEA, and our State Department has been depleted. Its budget has been cut, its personnel eviscerated, and I'm sorry, you have to understand we don't have the human resources in place right now for the kind of comprehensive negotiation that's about to happen. So I hope that our new Secretary of State is going to rectify that. He's going to reach out to you and to everybody else who is still interested in making sure that this is a successful process so that we, in fact, have a real chance at some traction. I can't tell you whether Kim Jong-un is serious this time or not, but I'll tell you that Xi and Abe and Putin, we all have a stake in how this comes out, and each set of interests are not necessarily going to be the same. And that's very different also from President Moon Jae-in. President Moon Jae-in has a real stake. He's the one, I believe, that deserves a Nobel Peace Prize.
The South Korean president.
The South Korean president who stuck his neck out. And Kim perhaps needs to get one with him, because Kim Jong-un, whatever we think of him, I don't know, we'll watch him. But those two people are the agents of change for the Korean Peninsula. no matter what we do or what Xi does or what Abe does. That's where the game is.
The two Korean leaders.
The two Korean leaders.
If I could just add, I think I agree with you about the State Department not being staffed to deal with all these and other issues, not only in East Asia, but other issues. But there's a way around, and we can come full circle to your first question. I think when it comes to the actual denuclearization aspects, if we get that far, the U.S. should not do it alone, should not take the lead, but we shouldn't do it alone. I think we should bring in China. Make the Chinese pay for some of the denuclearization. Send out Chinese experts. If they fail, then their credibility, their scientific community, technological prowess are on the line. Also, make them pay so that it's an investment to keep North Korea denuclearized, or at least committed to that path. Bring in Europeans, bring in others who have the technical expertise to do some of the work, because I don't think the U.S., first of all, has the human power to do it, but also I don't think the U.S. should take on this burden by itself, frankly. And this is where working with China, being multilateralist in trying to secure the peninsula as a nuclear-free zone is something that can bring people together. Europeans are also invested in the security of the Korean peninsula. They do not want to see a nuclear Korea. So bring them all in, make them pay. You know, working together, multiple heads could be better than one.
I could not agree with you more. I think it's a hard-headed but right decision to make this an international project. You are both so smart and so interested and thoughtful. Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. And a fascinating conversation is not over. We have microphones for all of you who would like to ask questions. The only request I'd make is, as brief as possible, make sure there's a question mark attached to the end of your statement. Please.
So I want to ask a long-term issue. How much of collaboration in science research will you expect in the future between United States and China, or United States or other Asian country?
How much cooperation in scientific research?
Scientific research.
And maybe if I could just put a twist on the end of your very good question. One of the big competitions underway is the Americans and the Chinese want to be the first to master artificial intelligence, quantum computing. This is our qualitative military edge over China. If we lose it, if our scientists lose this, then there's a big, perhaps, power differential that emerges. I would just add that to your very good
Why don't
question.
you answer it?
You're the experts.
We're all experts.
I would say, in answer to your question, it gets back to this partnership competition conundrum. We can be working with China productively, positively, in a lot of areas, and we are. I teach at a university that has a tremendous number of Chinese students who are enriching us by their presence, and I hope that we're enriching them. But there's a competitive aspect of this relationship. We both want to be the #1 power militarily in the Asia, Indo-Pacific, and a lot of it will rest on which of us wins the battle of ideas, the knowledge battle, in the digital world that's coming, that we're in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, we mentioned them before, and the Chinese have one advantage. The Chinese government can direct a lot of money into one funnel using state enterprises. The United States government, we're a decentralized society. We've got to rely on MIT and Caltech and Carnegie Mellon and be hopeful that it all amounts to an American success. So I worry about this because I want the United States to be, frankly, more powerful than China militarily in the future.
I would just say I think competition is a good thing. And so cooperation is possible in areas of new science and inquiry, right, in education, in experimental sciences. With the US and Japan in the 1980s, we were competitors economically, right? But we still work together in the space realm. We still work together in different places. And I think the key for the US-China ability to cooperate will be intellectual property rights protections, will be reciprocity. How many of our scientists get to go to Chinese laboratories, for example? How do we manage this competition in a way that we can also take advantage of the intellectual challenge that's ahead of us? And that's the cooperative side of the game, I think, for us.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'd like to thank the panel for opening up a nice new field of discussion where we didn't hear the word collusion once. My question is mainly the possibilities of a breakup, because I've studied comparative politics for quite a while, and the Soviet Union was considered a monolith, cohesive, unassailable, and before we knew it, most of the people, 90% of the people thought this way. Before we knew it, they'd broken up. Now, they had a loophole in their constitution permitting secession, and I was curious as to, do the Chinese have that? And secondly, the Chinese have, in the 20th century, had this history of ruled by the warlords and Chiang Kai-shek shuffling them around and dominoes and whatever. Do they have that situation now with the military districts and different commanders? Is it all political?
Great question.
What a good question. The Chinese believe that they've learned the lessons.
Right.
Gorbachev committed a mortal sin. He tried to reform the economy, perestroika, and open up the society, glasnost, simultaneously, and they said, we'll never do that. Have they learned the lesson well enough?
Oh, and then you have these migrant workers. They're a terrible problem. They're in terrible straits. They're practically second and third class citizens. There are a lot of potentials, it seems to me, for breakup.
Kathy, Sheila.
Okay. There's a lot in there, so I'll just maybe take a strand of it. As Ambassador Burns said, the Chinese are steeped in history, and they do like to go back to history, both for positive examples as well as negative, to avoid the negative. I think in terms of China, it really does have, the government has a huge task to basically hold people together. As you said, it is not a monolith. To the outside world, it may be, but internally it is not. So I think when I look at, if I were a leader in China, every day what I'd be worrying about is how to hold this, quote, nation state together with so many multiple nations that compose that huge landmass. The other aspect here that resonates is that, you know, the current leaders are not the only ones in China, are not the only ones who learned from their mistakes regarding the fall of the Soviet Union. There are people who are wondering if Kim Jongun in North Korea will he end up a Gorbachev? And is he opening up a Pandora's box that he will not be able to control? And so I think many of these leaders that come from these closed societies, centralized machineries, this is the big fear they have. And I think they will do everything they can to try to prevent that. That's partly why the Chinese government is not loosening up. It's actually becoming less open about the political tightness, repression. Its authoritarianism is getting stronger, not weaker, as the per capita income grows. Normally, academics have said when nations' GDP per capita increases and they reach a certain point of middle income, they democratize. China is an exception, and I think because it does not want to make this mistake of the Soviet Union, and it does not want to open up a chaotic situation because of all of the different nations that it is holding together.
The Chinese Communist Party will have to make sure that it continues to be the party that rules China. I mean, it is the party that has ensured that there is a cohesive, unified government in China. And a large way that they've done that is by redistributing economic gains, right? The Chinese economy is growing much faster than ours. Will continue to do that for some time. But as their growth rate slows, they will need to think about ways to find the resources to make sure that the large and burgeoning middle classes of China have what they need. So you hear, as you said, you pointed out, I think, the migrant labor issue, the movement from regional to urban areas. They've begun talking about privatizing, you know, they can sell homes now. They can do things with property in the regions in order to help make sure that the have-nots of the last decade or so are still in the economic game. But there's also questions of pollution, there's access to education, there's whether or not they can sustain investment in their country. There's an awful lot of Chinese capital entrepreneurial capital starting to move out of China. They had to clamp down on that to make sure that with capital controls to make sure that that wasn't an exodus that they couldn't control. So that balancing act, as Kathy said, that balancing act between making sure that the entire country is cohesive. Part of that challenge is under Xi Jinping is going to be faith and belief that Xi himself and the Communist Party can lead the Chinese into the next era. And Xi himself uses language about the Chinese dream that speaks to that desire to have a, if not an ideology, at least a vision that all Chinese think that they are a part of. That's a very tough task in a country as expansive as China and as populous as China. So I don't know. It's hard to tell. I don't think the country is about to break up. I am not thinking that's imminent, but it's a very tough governance challenge, as Kathy said.
Please.
Hi, I work with Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, and Mr. LaRouche called for the Four Powers Agreement in 2009, that India, China, Russia, and the United States should work together to replace the dying Anglo-Dutch liberal system, financial system. And we've seen a lot of that moving into place, except for India recently. However, over the last few days, there was a historic meeting between India and China in Wuhan. And this is happening while we see historic things on the Korean Peninsula. India and China decided then to work together in Afghanistan to build infrastructure in Afghanistan. So I would say that I agree with Mr. Burns that there are positive aspects to the One Belt, One Road. I would go further and say it's really a means for complete cooperation, for mutual interests. And I believe that President Trump is moving in the right way to work with President Xi of China. He's praised him multiple times, and to meet and sit down with President Putin and also cooperate. Because if these four countries do, I would say there's no problem really that could not be solved. So if you have any comments.
So thank you for this question, and it allows us to talk about something we haven't mentioned. President Trump has very poor relations with Angela Merkel, Theresa May. He got off to a rocky start with the Australians. No one ever argues with the Australians. But he's had a very successful relationship with Xi Jinping, right, from the get-go, from the Mar-a-Lago summit. Does this encourage you to think about stability in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, as senior fellow for Japan, I have to say, Mr. Abe was not terribly happy that Mr. Xi got
Abe
the
was first with the
Mar-a-Lago
Gulf
treatment.
diplomacy.
Yes, so
Yeah.
Japanese Prime Minister Abe went to Mar-a-Lago first and played lots of golf, and that relationship has been a deeply personal one. And when Mr. Trump started tweeting about my dear friend Xi Jinping, I don't think Mr. Abe was all that comfortable with that.
Yeah.
I think this president likes personal diplomacy. I think that's his strength. I think it is, and you can see it. You can see it in the Twitter. You can see it in the way he thinks about problem solving. With Kim Jongun, for example. I think he would like to have a different relationship with Mr. Putin, but as we know, that's a difficult political challenge for him.
We won't mention the word collusion.
We're not going to. I didn't want to say that word. I'm not 100% convinced, to be quite honest with you, that China, Russia, India, and the United States are the four countries that will exercise financial management capability in the years to come. I wouldn't put Russia in the mix. I just wouldn't. I do think, though, that you have a lot of potential for the United States and China in the financial side of things with Japan and with other G7 countries. There's a lot of ways in which we can think about economic management in slightly different groupings than we do today. Russia, I think is a bit of a stretch in terms of Russia's own economic power, frankly, and influence. But I don't think we should close out any options in terms of thinking about how we work with other countries for economic stability and prosperity.
And the largest economy in the world is the European Union.
It's the European
Bigger
Union,
than ours.
right. And I was implying that with the G7 comment.
Yeah.
But yeah, very important.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just looking at things from a historical point of view in my life. After Vietnam, it didn't take very long for the North to invade the South, and lo and behold, after a little bit of juggling, there wasn't mass murder all over the place, and now it's a single country. So the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese were Vietnamese, and they were happy to come together. Later on, I never thought I would see this in my life. When I was stationed in Germany, I took a flight to Berlin, and took a look at the Berlin Wall. And I said, my God, what a horrible thing to separate Germans from Germans. And in my lifetime, I saw that wall come down, and I saw people running across both sides, hugging each other, realizing that they were the same people. My question is, and I realize that this is a slightly different thing because of the years and years and years that have been involved with all of this stuff, but from what I see in South Korea, and from what I can determine from North Korea, let me step back just a second. When Kim Il-sung, or Kim Il-un, now whatever, crossed over and shook President Moon's hand, I almost dropped dead. That would have been an act of war
Right.
in next to no time. And I said, my God, if that can happen, then what happens when the Koreans realize, okay, North Korean, South Korean, we're all Koreans? I do believe that the South Koreans will be more than happy to help the infrastructure of the North Koreans. They'd get electricity, they'd get trains, and they'd get it would be an outpouring of love between two people. I think it might take a little bit of time because there were so many years there where there was animosity. But I think in the long run, people are people, and they do wind up coming together in a
Great
common
question.
bond.
That's a really
So,
good question.
I hope you can let me know that that's going to happen. I don't want to go to war again.
This is the
I'm
person
too
to
old.
answer your question.
No, we certainly hope none of us have to go to war, and I share your sentiments wholly. I also had that sense. I wasn't on the verge of tears. I was my jaws hurt from being agape the whole time. I was like this in shock watching Kim and Moon at the DMZ. It was a phenomenon. It was a phenomenon. If I could add a little bit of current day views among South Koreans to give you a sense of whether reconciliation and what you're alluding to is potential unification of the peninsula, whether this is a real possibility in the next 20, 30, 40 years. On the whole, Koreans in general, Southerners, Northerners, despite all the decades of harsh rhetoric against each other as enemies, as arch enemies, as not seeing one another as human beings, deep down inside, if they're given a chance, they do come together to acknowledge their common Koreanness. Having said that, though, when North Koreans come from the north into the south as so-called defectors, or I call them migrants because they're not all political defectors, they face extreme discrimination by South Koreans. They face language barriers because South Korean language uses so much English or anglicized terms in the Korean language itself that you can't finish one Korean sentence without having English words in them. And North Koreans who are living in South Korea find that very, very confusing because they didn't speak that way in the north. Apart from that, there is a huge difference in terms of education, also in terms of a physical appearance. Northerners, when my mom was born in what is now North Korea, her whole father's line, her patrilineage comes from what is now North Korea. And she's been in the US 50, 60 years now. The Northerners used to be considered the taller, bigger, handsome people on the Korean Peninsula. Now it's switched over because the South Koreans are so much taller, so much bigger, so much more massed, body mass, than the North Koreans. North Koreans, even those who have come from elite families, they are stunted. and you can tell right away. So there are so many markers of differentiation between the Southerners and the Northerners. And the question is, will the, quote, common bloodline that political elites like to talk about, will the common history of the past prior to the division be enough to bring people together? It's a question mark, to tell you the truth, because South Koreans are very afraid about their pocketbooks. Like other living in capitalist societies, they don't want their taxes touched, not too much. They don't want to have job competition with any North Koreans. And yet North Koreans, if there is unification, will not put up with second, third class citizenship in South Korea. So I really have serious concerns. My current book is about this, that I don't think all is going to be rosy on the Korean Peninsula. When you say this is the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning, etc., if there is to be unification, it's going to take a long time, and my God, the Koreans and the rest of us need to be thinking way ahead about all of the difficulties to come. It will not be an easy road to integrate two peoples. I want to mention the Panmunjom scene, the DMZ scene,
Please.
because this also gives you a clue about how serious the two Korean leaders are about the summit and the aftermath to now, and how the international community often misreads what's going on between the two Koreas. So when Kim and Moon first shook hands, Kim came to the southern side of the DMZ, right? That was what was scripted. It was all orchestrated ahead of time. That was agreed upon. And then we saw via cameras that they talk, and then Kim sort of guides, Moon to the northern side. And you see President Moon Jae-in of South Korea stepping onto North Korean sovereign territory, and people are going, oh my God, that was not scripted. On Twitter, my friends, some of my colleagues who are Korea experts were tweeting, look at how the North Koreans took over the agenda. Look how aggressively he's pushing Moon Jae-in to get over to the North Korean side. It wasn't part of the script. How can you trust blah, blah, blah? The day after, when the real news comes out from the Blue House, the South Korean White House, the administration's official spokesperson, it comes out that President Moon said to Mr. Kim while they were shaking hands on the southern side, so look, when do I get to go to North Korea? He initiated it, and Kim didn't miss a beat and said, how about now? And that's how Mr. Moon stepped over to the North Korean side. Mr. Moon was born in the North. His family comes from the North. When I saw that crossover that was not scripted, I was not thinking about how pushy the North Koreans were. The first thought I had was, my God, what is Moon Jae-in feeling that he has touched the soil of his birth, that he could not touch until this time?
Wow.
The human component, as you were pointing out. And I think we need to hold on to that. Not everything has to be so cynical.
So we are unfortunately out of time. I just wanted to say this has been illuminating, interesting. These are momentous issues. Thank you for bringing us back to the human element in this at the end of it, because that's what gives us hope for the future. But Dr. Smith, Dr. Moon, Professor Moon, thank you so much for being with us.
I'll come to your chair anytime.